The following is made possible by the spoils of conflict on the frontier and viewers like you. Hey y'all, and welcome back to the Weird and Unknown History Iceberg Layer 2. If you have not watched the first one, feel free to go back and watch that one first, but I will tell you that a lot of that stuff you might already be familiar with. There's not a ton of stuff in that surface layer that is not pretty common knowledge. Today, we're going to get into Layer 2, which does have a little bit more interesting stuff, and as we continue to go down, there will be more and more unknown, minor, and maybe interesting topics to go through and deep dive into. If there's anything in this iceberg that you would like to see a deep dive video made about, feel free to put it in the comment section. I am happy to do the deep research on any topic you'd like to see. But without further ado, let's get into Weird History Iceberg Layer 2. Okay, Layer 2 of the iceberg. Now, again, this will be slightly more known stuff. There's some things in here I think maybe people who are less interested in history, although I don't know why you'd be on this channel if you didn't love history, but hey, here we are. Some of this stuff, pretty interesting though, so let's get right into it. Up first, the Falklands War. Now, war is a subjective term in many ways. Ultimately, it all comes down to what is defined as a war in the aftermath of a given conflict. The Falklands War was a 10-week undeclared war between the United Kingdom and Argentina back in the 1980s, in 1982 to be exact. Now, the background here is that since the 70s, Argentina had been under the control of a military junta. So the military had seized control of their government. They'd been running things ever since, and it had not gone well. There was widespread civil unrest. The economy had stagnated. People were not stoked. The government of Argentina, led by General Leopoldo Galtieri, decided that the best way to handle the ongoing civil unrest was to distract everyone and drum up some patriotism by pointing out these two small British territory islands just off the coast of Argentina. And to be very specific here, we are talking about the Falkland Islands and their two territorial dependencies, which is South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands. These are very small territories settled by the British a long time ago and had remained British protectorates who governed themselves forever, basically. Most of the people that actually lived there were descendants of the original British settlers, and they did not want to be part of Argentina at all, and they immediately started kind of crying home as soon as the tension started to build around this issue. But General Galtieri was like, hey, Argentina needs to be standing on its own. We cannot allow, European powers to enforce their will upon us. Those should be our islands, and we might have to take them by force. Now, at this point, tensions start to rise. There's some kind of attempts at diplomacy, but they do fail, and eventually, on April 2nd, 1982, Argentina amphibiously lands troops on the Falkland Islands and then eventually on South Georgia as well. Now, the British, they see this in opposite terms. Margaret Thatcher's government is in charge, and she's like, this is a perfect opportunity for us to lay the smackdown on a weaker military power and gain some of our own patriotic fervor. So they dispatch a naval strike force, an aircraft carrier, and accompanying ships across the Atlantic Ocean. And shout out to Newsweek for this cover, The Empire Strikes Back. In 1982, that probably slapped. So 10-week conflict. There are casualties on both sides, although certainly more lopsided in the favor of the British. The British lose 255 killed and 775 wounded. The Argentinians take about 3 times that, with 650 killed and 1,657 wounded. 3 citizens of the Falkland Islands are killed as well, and the British eventually win. It is actually kind of a big political event for both countries. On the British side, it's a kind of moment of patriotic fervor, very similar, I think, to Desert Storm for the United States. It's like, hey, our military that hasn't been tested in a long time goes over across the world, is engaged for less than a couple months, kicks ass, and comes home to the cheers of everyone, kind of reminding the world that we're not to be messed with. Margaret Thatcher's government is reelected in the biggest landslide in UK history. On the other side, this plan totally backfired on the military junta government of Argentina, and this would eventually be the event that kind of began the dominoes tumbling that would collapse the military government of Argentina and lead to them moving towards democracy. Okay, next up is the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. This is a very little known part of United States history that is actually pretty fascinating. So the Hawaiian Islands, a chain of several hundred islands in the South Pacific, was an independent kingdom ruled by a queen of the Kamehameha dynasty for hundreds of years. But as American business interests began to migrate to the island, sugar plantations became kind of the primary export of the Hawaiian Islands, and the owners of these plantations, who were Americans, white men, became incredibly powerful, and eventually they grew tired of kind of kowtowing to the official whims of the queen. Hawaii was its own independent country. They had treaties with more than 70 nations. They had embassies. They had their own everything outside of a military, which might have come in handy. There was a group of American business owners comprised of both people who had moved from the United States and also people who were descendants of people who had moved from the United States, who were members of what was called the Annexation Club. These are people that wanted to have Hawaii become part of the United States. And eventually they grew tired of the Queen kind of getting in the way of their business interests. So eventually a subset of the Annexation Club, called the Committee of Safety, overthrew the Queen. They established Hawaii as a republic, and that existed for 4 years, at which time they were officially annexed by the United States. They became a territory. They remained that way for roughly 50 years, and then in 1959, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, they were admitted to the Union as the 50th state. This was important because, unlike other U.S. territories like, say, Puerto Rico, Hawaiians wanted full voting rights. They wanted representation in Congress. They wanted to be part of the Electoral College. I think what is sad about this is that this is kind of kept under the rug because it is an example of the United States being exactly kind of what it proclaims not to be. America has always shied away from its role as an imperial power, and obviously as a country that really prides itself on having thrown off the yoke of imperial rule and been the great American experiment in representative democracy, it doesn't love when that clashes with the real history of having been an imperial power in places like the Philippines or Hawaii. So the overthrow of a sovereign nation's head of state, landing troops on Hawaii, putting the Queen on house arrest in her own palace. And again, this was not a revolt or overthrow, a coup led by her own people. This was rich landowners from the United States and their kids who wanted her out of the way so that they could not be taxed by her. So, unfortunate, sad story, but an interesting genesis and origin story for one of our 50 states. Panzerschokolade is German for tanker's chocolate, and this is an old story about how the German military would give their troops chocolate laced with amphetamines, right? Meth chocolate, so that they could blitzkrieg their way across Europe or into the Soviet Union. There is debate among historians about whether or not this is real. It is absolutely a fact that the German Wehrmacht gave their troops amphetamine, specifically Pervitin, which was a amphetamine manufactured by the German pharmaceutical industry during World War II, in order to have them be able to operate for days on end without sleep. When you're trying to invade France and race to Paris, a big part of the German blitzkrieg, lightning warfare, was this race to the enemy rear with mechanized units, and that only really works if you can maintain mechanized speed for days on end to get around the flanks of the enemy forces. This is also not unique to the Germans in any way. Almost all sides in all wars in modern history give a lot of their troops something to keep them up. United States fighter pilots take Provigil, which is not an amphetamine, but definitely will have you wide awake. It's become very popular among like Silicon Valley CEOs. But the Germans were very notorious for their use of amphetamines during the Blitzkrieg operations, both in the invasion of France, the invasion of Poland, the invasion of the Soviet Union. But there is debate about whether or not it was administered via chocolate, which does add some kind of humor to it. The Nazis in general were huge fans of pharmacology as a method for increasing performance. Hitler had a personal doctor who shot him up with all manner of crazy shit to keep him wired and going at all times. You kind of see him giving those speeches where he just seems like he's wild as hell. And if you've ever been around someone who's done a precipitous amount of cocaine, Hitler in those speeches will seem familiar to you. If it turned out that his German was translated and he was describing how you need to start a business together at 3 a.m., it would all make sense. But yes, Tanker's chocolate, up for debate, but certainly not up for debate, the use of amphetamines during war. Funnily enough, the conflict we're currently seeing right now in Russia and Ukraine, there has been evidence found that Russian troops now are being given liquid amphetamine to continue the fight against Ukrainian forces as they attempted to blitz their way to Kiev in the opening hours of the invasion. So, long history of the use of amphetamines in warfare. In Germany specifically during World War II, more likely to see it in pill form than chocolate, but remains to be seen if Panzerschokolade was a real thing. Wunderwaffe is German for wonder weapon, and this is a both real and not real thing. So I think a lot of people are familiar with the term from the popular video game series Call of Duty, where you can get Wunderwaffen from in Nazi zombies. However, what this meant during World War II was this idea of Germany inventing these super advanced pieces of technology, like war-ending pieces of weaponry that could defeat vast swaths of Allied troops and turn the tide of the war. This came into existence for a couple reasons. One, the Germans did invent really impressive pieces of technology. The Me-262 by Messerschmitt is the world's first jet-powered aircraft. The V-1 and V-2 guided rockets were the first kind of ground-to-ground or surface-to-surface guided missiles that we would ever see in warfare. And the Sturmgewehr 44 was the world's first assault rifle. So there were tremendous advances in military technology, and the Germans' arms industry certainly had a role to play there. That said, German propaganda also played a huge role in the idea that the Germans were inventing crazy science fiction type technology. And if you grew up when I did in the early to mid 90s, you saw a lot of this on the History Channel, where there would be like Nazi secret weapons that they almost had, and it's like laser beams and flying saucers and tanks the size of cities. I mean, even if you watch like Marvel movies and you see in Captain America, the Red Skull, the Nazi, super scientist is creating all these crazy advanced science fiction type Cobra Commander type weapons. And a lot of that came from a combination of propaganda that the Nazis were pushing out into the world to convince people of Aryan superiority, and also propaganda internally in Germany, one, towards the people, to be like, hey, don't worry, we got this shit, we're super advanced and awesome, and two, the Germans' arm industry needed to convince Nazi high command to keep giving them money. And so if they go to Hitler and they're like, hey, we're going to make a bunch of tanks, they might get some money. If they go to Hitler and they go, we're making a tank the size of a city that weighs 100 million tons and can roll across Europe in 10 minutes and destroy all of the Jews, then they get unlimited funding. Now, what makes me kind of mad about this is that the effectiveness of Nazi propaganda has been proven by the fact that 50 years or 70 years after World War II, after the Nazis got their ass kicked, there's still like programs and media being made about the just unassailable genius of the Nazis and their incredible weapons. And in reality, the Nazis were a competent warfighting machine that made a bunch of horrible decisions and got beat time and time again by the United States, by the Soviet Union. The Soviet T-34 is probably the best tank of the war. It was the first tank that had sloped armor. It had a bunch of innovations that made it superior to any of these, the Nazi King Tiger tank. It's like the biggest tank ever made at the time. And yeah, it's huge, but there are no replacement parts for it. It's incredibly immobile. It doesn't have the agility to fight in open fields in Europe when the United States can make 25 Shermans for the price of one King Tiger. That's a waste of resources. So ultimately, I feel like we in the West have fallen for kind of the Nazi Aryan superiority propaganda that came out at the time, being like, yeah, if the Nazis had just had time and money, they would have come out with laser beams and AT-AT walkers and Star Destroyers. And no, man, they wouldn't have. They probably would have come out with some more interesting small arms and some more interesting aircraft, but they weren't the first to make the atomic bomb. That was the Americans. In fact, if the Nazis had really been the genius technical minds that they portrayed themselves to be, they probably wouldn't have run all of the Jewish scientists who were among the best in their country out of there before the war started. So the Nazis were hamstrung by their own arrogance, by their own inherent racism, and by the expectations that they set for themselves via propaganda of making these earth-shattering weapons that were never going to exist. So Wunderwaffe is a fun fodder for video games, for science fiction, for alternate history, but in reality, very little of it ever came to pass. And what did formed the building blocks of what would be later improved upon by Western and Eastern militaries in the Cold War. Napoleon true height. He was 5'6". Thanks for coming. No. I think the reason this is on here is because obviously there is the idea that Napoleon was the little general. We have the concept of a Napoleon complex, someone who compensates for their lack of height by being a big personality and being quick to anger. And in reality, this is a combination of a misunderstanding of data and, again, falling for propaganda from the time. Napoleon was 5'6", which sounds short, but in France in the 1800s was slightly higher than average. So he was like today's 5'11", 6 foot. He was called the Little General, often by his men, as a term of endearment, meaning, they loved him. Often the image of Napoleon as this small, diminutive, kind of crybaby figure is actually a product of political cartoons at the time. This is a very famous one. And his depiction in these political cartoons, some of which are considered some of the most effective of all time by the other European powers that he was currently beating the shit out of, that is stuck as a historical phenomenon ever since. And so even today, we describe a Napoleon complex. It is not actually rooted in very much fact around his actual size. So Napoleon's true height, 5'6", a little higher than average, but more a testament to the power of propaganda and its ability to snowball down through history into even kind of common cultural memory. Star Wars / SDI. SDI stands for Strategic Defense Initiative. This is a program that was announced by Ronald Reagan in 1983. The idea here was Ronald Reagan kind of announced to the nation in a televised speech that he wanted America's scientists to turn their brilliance and ingenuity towards creating a defense system that would be capable of negating any nuclear attack on the United States, particularly from intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. This was an era where the United States and the Soviet Union had built a number of nuclear warheads that could have eventually destroyed life on this planet hundreds of times over. Each side has tens of thousands of nuclear-tipped warheads. Some of them are in silos in missiles underground all over their territory. Some of them are on submarines that are constantly patrolling the oceans and can pop out and end life at a moment's notice. And Reagan dreamed of a system of perhaps spaceborne lasers that could shoot down ICBMs or missiles that could hit other missiles like we see with Iron Dome or the Patriot missile system today. This is somewhat debated as to whether or not it was truly the desire of Ronald Reagan to build this program or whether it was the desire of Ronald Reagan for the Russians to waste money trying to keep up with the United States from a capability standpoint around missile defense. Either way, it did end up being kind of a huge waste of money for the United States. While we did learn some things about missile defense that would form the bedrock and foundation of systems like Patriot and Iron Dome, we never found a good way to take out incoming missile attacks, at least not in large numbers. Some of the systems that we have now could probably stop a single warhead in flight. Aegis, again, Patriot, Iron Dome. But if an entire country like the Soviet Union in 1983 that had something like 20,000 warheads launches, an end-of-the-world type strike on the United States, there is no system that can stop that. So ultimately, there will kind of always be debate around what Reagan really meant by that, what was his purpose, and was it a good idea? From the Soviet perspective, what we know now that the Soviet Union collapsed and a lot of their records have become publicly available to us, they took it as an escalation. So they felt very threatened by this, and it certainly dialed up tension with the Soviet Union. Although Reagan seems to think of it more along the lines of, if both sides had this system, it would negate nuclear weapons and we would no longer be under threat of mutually assured destruction, which Reagan always viewed as sort of an international suicide pact. So certainly a very interesting program, and I think it's something that we don't see very often anymore, that the president would, instead of just like going to the Pentagon and being like, hey, here's an idea for a program, just getting on TV and being like, hey, public challenge to all scientists. Like, very interesting. So that is Star Wars. Fun fact, George Lucas sued Reagan for the name Star Wars because he had already made Star Wars. Fascinating. William Martin is the fake name of a fake Royal Marine at the center of Operation Mincemeat, something that we referenced earlier in this iceberg. Operation Mincemeat was one of these Allied operations to confuse and misdirect Nazi high command about the Allies' invasion of Europe. So, at this point in the war, the Allies have taken back Northern Africa, and the Nazis are confined to continental Europe. But they don't want the Nazis to know where they're going to land next. It could be France, it could be Greece, it could be Italy, but they don't want them to know because they will mass troops there and push the Allies back into the sea. The Allies come up with this plan. They get the body of a recently deceased Welsh homeless man. They dress him up as a Royal Marine, and they give him a set of incredibly convincing classified documents that say that the Allies are going to land in Greece. And they put those documents in a satchel on him, and they drop him at sea just off the coast of Spain. Body washes ashore. He's found. The documents are taken to the local German garrison, and they find their way up the chain of command to Nazi high command, and it works. The Germans shift troops to Greece to prepare for the Allied landings, and when the Allies actually land in Sicily, resistance is lighter than expected. The quick progress the Allies made enabled the collapse of the Mussolini government and Italy switching sides, which was the first topic on this iceberg. And so this very small little misdirection actually proved to be of incredible strategic value to the Allies and a huge boondoggle for the Axis powers. The Welsh homeless man who his body was used was declared a national hero once the operation was declassified 50 years later. And while he didn't live to see his incredible accomplishment, he played a huge role in the victory of democracy over the forces of fascism. So shout out to him. His name is, and I'm going to butcher this because it's a Welsh name, Glyndwr Michael, Glyndwr, Glyndwr? Welsh fans out there, holler at your boy, tell me how to say it. I apologize. But shout out to him, the fake William Martin, the real last name Michael. Dude, this guy was a hero, even in death. Nazi trees is a reference to something that I would not have put on this iceberg. This is just a grove of trees in Brandenburg, a region of Germany, that were planted in 1938 in honor of Hitler's birthday. He was the Chancellor of Germany at the time. And they didn't grow until obviously many years later. And when the trees changed color in autumn, the surrounding trees were green. These trees were a different color, and they formed a swastika. It made, national and international news. The trees were eventually ripped up. It's funny, I guess, but at the same time, I don't know if it's like a prominent moment of history, really. So, yeah, here you go, Nazi trees. That's it. New Swabia is a tiny chunk of Antarctica that during the late 1930s was explored and claimed for Germany by a German expedition dispatched by the Nazi government. It was named after the ship, the German ship that took the guys that were on the expedition to Antarctica. As such, it is a piece of Nazi Antarctica, technically. I think it's notable to some people because there are conspiracy theories that say that the Nazis established some crazy secret Antarctica base. That's not true. And so it's on here. Again, another one where it's like, cool, man, just because the Nazis did something doesn't mean it's notable. But hey, it's on here. The Nazis went to Antarctica one time. The Ghost Blimp is referencing a blimp that was renamed L8 for military service during World War II. And the wake of the Japanese attacks at Pearl Harbor and another one off of Santa Barbara in California, the United States immediately kind of went into high-tension scared mode, especially on the West Coast where the Japanese would conceivably conduct military operations. They also confiscated or commandeered Goodyear's fleet of 5 blimps. So the Goodyear blimps you see fly over football games every Sunday, those were commandeered by the United States military to do things like transporting stuff to naval bases or doing reconnaissance for submarines off the coast of the United States. And this particular blimp, L8, it does have a prominent moment in history. It actually helped transport Doolittle's Raiders, which, if you don't know what that is, we might do a video on it someday. It was a group of American bombers who went on a one-way trip to Japan in the wake of Pearl Harbor just to get like some get back. They just spun the block on Japan. They couldn't, based on fuel, get to Japan and back. So they got as far as they could into the Pacific Ocean on carriers before the Japanese Navy would find them. They flew their planes to Japan, dropped bombs, and then ditched into China and tried to make it to the U.S. allies in China at the time. So that's a crazy story. And this blimp helped transport parts to the aircraft carrier that was carrying Doolittle's Raiders. So it had a prominent role in history. The reason it's called the Ghost Blimp is because one night it was on patrol. It went off into the fog. They lost touch with it via radio. It reappeared on the beach and appeared to have no one in the gondola. Some surfer fisherman guys like pulled the cords that were hanging from it down, and there was no one in it. They couldn't keep a hold of it. It drifted back off and ended up crashing in a residential neighborhood in California. They never found the crew. No idea what happened. But it was a bizarre situation where this ghost blimp just kind of disappeared, all the people disappeared, and then the blimp came back, but the people didn't. So, again, like, man, out of all the stuff to put on this iceberg, it's like, is that a cool thing? Sure. You know, I think there are more interesting ghost vehicle or ghost place incidents than this. And maybe we'll talk about those later in the iceberg or on some other one, but that's the ghost blimp for you. Shout out to Goodyear. Project Ries, which is German for giant, was this giant construction project the Germans undertook in modern-day Poland. It was 7 huge underground structures that they put together near the end of the war. A big piece of this is the debate around what these structures were for. Some people think they were the future Führer headquarters if Berlin fell. Some say that based on the efficacy of Allied bombing, Germany was trying to move a lot of its arm industry into subterranean structures like this. I think the reason it's really notable is that the construction of these facilities took a huge toll. And, of course, the Germans, being who they were at the time, used 13,000 laborers from POW and concentration camps, particularly Dachau. 5,000 of those laborers perished trying to build these structures. There's really not any completed plans or completed documentation of what they were going to be used for. Like anything with the Nazis, when they're building giant underground bunkers underneath castles in remote mountains, people start to let their mind wander about, again, Wunderwaffen. But what's really, I think, notable here is the scale of the human tragedy involved in building these bunkers. The Nazis just were some of the most evil human beings to ever exist, and this is yet another example of that. So that was Project Rise. The Battle of Los Angeles. Now, if you see this on the Iceberg, you might think it's referring to that kind of not very good movie from a couple years ago. But this is actually a reference to, again, in the wake of Pearl Harbor, the whole West Coast was very terrified of Japanese attack. One night, a high-altitude weather balloon drifted over Los Angeles, and it triggered an air raid response. So the whole city of LA blacked out, and for 5 or 6 hours, they just filled the sky with anti-aircraft munitions. So flat cannons and machine gun fire just spraying over the entire skyline of LA. It was, in fact, a false alarm. There were no Japanese forces in the area, but it's noted as like the Battle of Los Angeles because there's these crazy photographs of just, the sky lighting up. Fortunately, LA was never attacked, but it goes to show you the level of fear and paranoia that was present in the wake of the Pearl Harbor attacks, America having very rarely ever been attacked on its own soil. The fear of Japanese attack on the West Coast eventually led to the putting of Japanese American citizens into internment camps all over the western coast of the United States, which is, I think, one of the under-discussed atrocities of our history. And it is truly, truly a tragedy that patriotic Americans in this country who happened to be from a place we went to war with were put in camps. The same cannot be said for the Germans, who were every bit as horrible. But nonetheless, this does speak to the level of fear and paranoia present in the population at the time. Thankfully, like I said, the Battle of Los Angeles was not a battle. It was simply the combined anti-aircraft munitions of the area of Los Angeles versus one poor lost weather balloon. So that's the Battle of LA. The search for the Spear of Destiny, very similar to the search for the Holy Grail, although it gets less good PR than the Holy Grail. The Spear of Destiny, or the true lance, is the spear the Roman soldier pierced the side of Christ with in the biblical story of the crucifixion. Many monasteries and churches all over Europe claim to have a piece of the Spear of Destiny, and there are pervasive myths around the power of the Spear of Destiny, what it can do for a ruler, for the faithful, for an army with it marching at its head. But again, there is not a ton of actual history around this particular item. You have to think, at the time, people seem to believe that, like, in his own day, Christ was Christ. That is not the case. Christians were effectively a cult, and whoever this random soldier was that watched this guy die, he didn't immediately place his daily spear he used every day at work into a box and preserve this item. That stuff got put back in at the barracks and probably used by a different soldier the next day. So yeah, very difficult to know what the true Spear of Destiny would be, and there isn't actually a ton of history around the provenance of that particular weapon. German Tibet is a reference to the German expedition to the country of Tibet in 1938-1939 as part of their kind of effort to uncover Germanic and Aryan heritage. Heinrich Himmler, the SS, and the Nazi government in general sponsored a lot of scientific expeditions under the auspices of, hey, go find evidence of the cradle of the Aryan race, etc. In this particular situation, the German scientist Schaefer had been to Tibet a bunch of times. He was a real scientist, and Himmler wanted him to look for proof of this thing called world ice theory, which was this totally bonkers pseudo-scientific belief by this Austrian wacko that the Nazis bought into. It was the idea that came to him in a vision, by the way, so not exactly the scientific method here, that ice was kind of the basic building block of all of the cosmos. The reason the Nazis liked it was that so many important scientists and figures in the natural sciences, the real science of the world and its creation, were Jewish. And so they looked at world ice theory as a alternative to that could be stamped as Germanic. And so when they found Schaefer, who was a very prominent scientist and explorer who was German, they wanted to utilize him to go out into the world and kind of spread and bring evidence for their totally wacko theories. As part of this expedition, everyone on the expedition was made to join the SS in order to go on it. It's kind of up for debate about how enthusiastic everyone was about that. And Schaefer, one, didn't take the Nazis' money, and he did not let anyone come on the expedition who was, one of these world ice theory people. So ultimately, Himmler was not super stoked with him. And the actual trip to Tibet ended up being more scientific than the Nazis probably intended for it to be. They brought back tons of specimens from all kinds of insects and dogs and food. The one piece of it that did end up being of value to the Nazis was that as part of their kind of scientific research and preparation for Lebensraum, living space, they brought back a bunch of different samples of different grains, and they wanted to find or create a strain of grain that would grow well in the kind of shitty Eastern European soil. And they used the grain samples brought back by Schaefer on this trip to make those attempts. But ultimately, unlike many other scientific explorations to the Middle East and Egypt, etc., during this time, Schaefer did not allow his scientific expedition to be completely co-opted by the SS, although him and his buddies did end up having to get membership cards in order to get cleared to go. So that is Nazi Tibet. The Battle of Castle Itter is by far one of the strangest battles of World War II. So this takes place 5 days after Adolf Hitler had committed suicide and only a couple days before the Germans surrender. So by all accounts, this battle probably should not have happened. There's complete chaos in the German military as soon as word spreads that Hitler's killed himself. And it takes place in a castle, Castle Itter, in Austria. So what had happened was the Germans had occupied this area of Austria. They had found this castle, and it had been requisitioned by the SS and made a kind of VIP prison as part of the nearby Dachau concentration camp. So any high importance prisoners who might have been requisitioned to Dachau were sent here to keep them away from other prisoners or anyone stirring up trouble in occupied areas of Western Europe like France. So in this prison are Jean Bourassa, the famous European tennis player, 2 former French prime ministers, Charles de Gaulle's sister, and several high-profile members of the French resistance. As May 1945 rolls around and it becomes clear that this war is going to end poorly for the Germans, the concentration camp SS Guard garrison that's in this prison is kind of in a chaotic state. The commander of this prison, it's up for debate. He either kills himself or dies under mysterious circumstances, but as soon as that happens, the rest of the SS officers flee. All right, so they all dip. The prisoners are left alone, and they arm themselves with the weapons that are in the castle. They send their Czech cook out on a bike with a note trying to find the first Americans they can see to have them come rescue them, because they're still in German-occupied territory. In the nearby town, there is the remnants of a normal German army unit, so not an SS unit, but a Wehrmacht unit. And that is under the command of Major Josef Gangl. Josef is a Wehrmacht officer. He's not an SS officer, and he defied German High Command's orders to retreat back to Germany. He decided to stay in this area of Austria, throw in with the local resistance, and basically defend this tiny Austrian town from reprisal attacks by the SS. There were still roaming bands of SS units that would summarily execute any male as a deserter. They would fire into any window that had a white or an Austrian flag. And Gangl was basically gambling on surviving long enough for the Americans to make it there so he could surrender to them rather than being wiped out by, again, these kind of bloodthirsty, true believer SS units. The Americans are moving towards this area, and a reconnaissance unit of the American Armored Division that's headed this way, gets word that there is this prison with some pretty high-end prisoners of great importance to France in the area, and they make contact with Gangel. Gangel's like, look, I'm down for the cause now. I'm switching teams, which, very cool. Not tight to ever be a Nazi, but making the right decision here. And the Americans and Gangel, this tiny reconnaissance unit, plus a few Nazi officers who had switched sides, make it to Castle Itter and find the prisoners. At that exact moment, about 200 SS officers figure out the Americans and these traitor Wehrmacht officers and these prisoners are no longer under Nazi control, and they decide to attack this castle. The Americans and Gangel's men tell these prisoners to go hide, but the French prisoners are like, screw that, man, we're staying out here and fighting alongside the Americans and the Wehrmacht troops. And all through the night of May 5th, 1945, they fight off a full-fledged attack by German artillery, full SS infantry units. It's a crazy battle. Finally, in the morning, American reinforcements get there. Over 100 SS troops are taken prisoner, and so ends one of the craziest battles of the war. Unfortunately, Gangel, who not only defended the local town from SS reprisals, he actually passed away during this engagement. He was the only casualty. He was moving one of the former French prime ministers out of harm's way and took a Mauser rifle round. So he was posthumously promoted to captain, given the Distinguished Service Cross, and he is now a national hero in Austria. So despite being on the wrong team for the entire war, he did something heroic at the end to save the former French Prime Minister, Paul Renard. So crazy battle, super bizarre. There are several of these in history, battles that take place after the ends of wars that are just filled with chaos and really nebulous kind of blurring of the lines around who's on whose team. But the Battle of Castle Itter certainly falls into that category. It's definitely worth looking up, and I highly recommend taking a deep dive into this one because it is one of those bizarre things that really only happens in the waning days of a major conflict. Project Pigeon was a project by an American behavioral scientist during World War II. This was an attempt to use explosives attached to pigeons as guided bombs, and the use of multiple pigeons to course correct a pigeon with an explosive to guide it towards a target. It ended up not being viable, but they did learn a lot about how to guide munitions in on a target using triangulation, and we also learned a lot about how pigeons behave. Some of the stuff discovered during this project would actually eventually be used in the development of real guided munitions, but with processors and electronic sensors replacing the pigeons. So Project Pigeon, an interesting little tidbit in history, and certainly a terrifying weapon. You see a bunch of pigeons coming and they all start exploding. Damn, dude. Kind of glad that didn't end up working, to be honest with you. Operation Unthinkable was the name of two different strategic plans that the British High Command made in top secret at the end of World War II. So in 1945, as things are winding down, many at the very top of the Allied military command realized that while the Soviets had been incredibly valuable allies for destroying Hitler, the next conflict was going to be with this. I think the most famous iteration of this is George S. Patton was very famous for being like, hey, we already got all our guys over here. Let's just push right through Berlin to Moscow and kick their ass while we can, while we have the bomb and they don't. Fortunately, that was not done. I think the casualties and the death and destruction of World War II was plenty without us going to war with the Soviet Union. But the British were certainly thinking about it as well. The first iteration of Operation Unthinkable was a surprise attack on Soviet troops in Germany. And this was to impose the will of the United States and the British Empire on Soviet forces. They were worried about what the Soviets would do with all this land that they had gobbled up on the way to Berlin. The conclusion that they came to when working through this scenario was that, one, unless the United States was 100% on board, they could not do it. And two, even if the United States was on board, it was very unlikely that they would win a quick and decisive victory, and it would turn into this like endless slog of a war where tens of millions would die. So they scrapped that and they reused the name for a defensive action, which would be that if the Soviets tried to drive to the North Sea and the Atlantic right after the Americans withdrew from the continent in large numbers, obviously some American troops stayed behind to occupy Germany, but if the Soviets decided to just push their luck and go for the North Sea and the Atlantic, once the bulk of American troops were back across the Atlantic at home, the British developed this plan. None of them were ever kind of put into action, and fortunately the Soviets, unbeknownst or maybe only a little beknownst to the Allies, they were pretty tapped, man. They had lost close to 20 million people, and they needed a lot more in the way of rebuilding than even the Allied nations did. So fortunately, these were never used, and the Allies and the Soviets would lock into the Cold War. The Iron Curtain would descend across Europe, and the only conflict that would ever be sparked between the two sides would be proxy battles in places, far-flung locales. But this plan was never needed. However, fascinating to look into the plans that were made in case something like this had happened, and there's certainly a ton of fascinating alternate history around if Operation Unthinkable had to come into play. Luck of Kokura is a common Japanese saying, and it's a reference to the fact that the city of Kokura in Japan was the original target for Fat Man, the Enola Gay's atomic bomb that hit Nagasaki. The story is that when, at the time, air forces, and particularly the United States Air Force, did not trust radar-guided bombs yet, and so they still used visual bomb-dropping techniques, including the Norton bomb sight, which was pretty accurate for what it was, but when you're at, tens of thousands of feet, you can only see so much. You need to be able to see the target on the ground to initiate a drop. When they got over Kokura, there was cloud cover. Now, there's debate in history around if this was smoke from fire bombings in Tokyo, if this was a Japanese smoke screen that was intentionally put up, or whether it was just weather. But either way, it was such that they could not see the target that they were aiming for, which didn't particularly matter given that you're dropping an atomic bomb, but they couldn't see anything, and so they proceeded to the secondary target, which was Nagasaki. The same thing happened there, actually, but right at the very end of their run, when they were prepared to just turn around and go back to Okinawa, the clouds split for just long enough for them to see the industrial zone they were targeting with Fat Man, and they dropped the atomic bomb. And to this day, the idea of cloud cover kind of saving the lives of tens of thousands is described as the luck of Kokura. That is where the phrase comes from. Heavy water plant. In this iceberg, I'm assuming what this is a reference to is the sabotage of a Norwegian water plant in World War II. Heavy water was one of the theorized methodologies for creating an atomic or nuclear reactor, one of the substances you might need to create one of these. Norway had the world's first water plant capable of producing sufficient amounts of heavy water in order to potentially create an atomic weapon. With the race between the United States and the Germans to achieve the bomb, it was decided to be a strategic imperative to deny the Germans access to heavy water. And so while Norway was still neutral on the eve of the war, the French actually took all the heavy water that they had ever produced, which I think is about 12 tons a year, out of that plant and hid it in France. And then when the Germans actually took over the plant and tried to move some of the heavy water from that facility elsewhere, theoretically to use in the development of the bomb, Allied forces, including French resistance fighters, Norwegian resistance, and British SOE operatives, worked to sabotage those efforts and sink the ship transporting it. As it would turn out later, heavy water was not a viable pathway to creating an atomic weapon, but it was theoretically viable at the time, and so this was a super important mission. The heavy water plant was eventually disabled using a series of sabotage efforts. So, yeah, an interesting story to be sure, but kind of taken down in importance by the fact that it turns out not to be the best route to create the bomb. And if you've seen Oppenheimer, you remember the moment where they walk in and say they're using heavy water, and they all cheer because they know in that moment they're ahead because the Germans took a wrong turn. So, heavy water plant, there you go. Submarines in 1776. This is a reference to the fact that the world's first viable submarine used in warfare was created by a New Yorker in 1776. It was called the Turtle. It was a one-man submarine that used a hand pump to pump water in and out of the hull to sink and surface it. And it was used in warfare during the American Revolution. In New York Harbor was the HMS Eagle, a British warship that was anchored there, and they used this submarine to plant a bomb on it. So the first use of submarine warfare by the Americans, the Turtle, which is an awesome name for this particular submarine, that is submarines in 1776. And last, and actually least, for Layer 2 is Command & Conquer predicts 9/11. I detest things like this. This is the kind of thing like The Simpsons predicted XYZ, whatever predicted 9/11. People forget that, one, the World Trade Center was attacked prior to 9/11. In the early 90s, there was a terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. Two, the World Trade Center was an iconic piece of American symbolism, right? It represented free trade. It represented the American skyline in our largest city. The idea that the World Trade Center would be attacked in a piece of media is exactly the same reason why it was attacked in real life. So it shouldn't be seen as like crazy that someone wrote a piece of fiction where this was attacked. That's like being like, if the Statue of Liberty had been attacked and then someone was like, Planet of the Apes predicted this attack, right? It was a logical target for this kind of politically motivated attack. The reference here specifically is the game Red Alert 2, where it is an alternate history where the Soviet Union survived, thrived in the face of World War II and the Cold War, and they eventually, in the modern day, invade the United States. And there's some box art, and there's also an opening kind of cinematic where Soviet paratroopers are jumping out over New York, and they let their plane hit the World Trade Center. They also let their planes hit a whole bunch of other buildings, but no one talks about that. So again, I kind of loathe things like this. They act like this had some connection, as if the guys at Westwood Studios got a call and they were like, hey, throw this in. Like, none of that happened, but it is the last thing on this layer of the iceberg, so we will cover it. That's where it is. Thanks so much, guys. Okay, so that is the first 2 layers of the weird and unknown history iceberg. We'll be back shortly with layers 3 and possibly 4. We'll see how I end up dividing this. But if there's anything else you'd like to see about some of these topics, feel free to leave a comment down there. Also, please like and subscribe so we can continue to get some of these in front of a few more folks who might be interested in seeing some of the icebergs, some of the other videos we put out on this channel. As always, thank you guys so much for tuning in to Stupid Interesting. We'll be back soon with more of the Weird History Iceberg. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.